December Sun by J. Wilburn. Dead Morose stood at the very edge of where the brittle grasses met the solid sheets of ice. There were plenty of spots just like this unremarkable border, all through the tundra, driving further and further north out of the world of men. This border, this line in ice, and the uncovered life of cold places marked the sovereign territory of the Grey Elves. Dead Morose had no illusions he was one of them, even though he had lived and fought among them and for them for centuries. That was a long time, even for creatures who lived thousands of years with ease. Dead saw his breath. It meant heat inside his lungs. It didn't always happen when he exhaled, because though he looked like a man, and maybe he had been a man early in his life, he was something different now. He was something other than. He would always be a stranger among whatever people took him. The other two stood back a few steps from the border. Dead toed with his fur boot. His weary-aged eyes stared into the snow-blind distance. His eyes fooled him into believing all sorts of shapes and monsters prowled about the snow within his view. Delusions were very human, almost as human as seeing your breath. His ears captured the sounds of hungry howls rolling down the exposed swatches of mountains out at the edge of his field of vision. Those were no natural beasts, and their territory began out on that edge. From this distance, he could tell himself it was the wind he heard. It would not be a lie. There was plenty of wild wind making its own sounds across the top of the world, but it wasn't the truth. It was howls. They were hungry, and they were about to feed. As he strained his ears, he heard the breathing coming from both his elbows and startled. His heart thudded a drum beat in his ears as he only just noticed the gray elf leaders now at his elbows at the icy edge. Elzarel, on his right, whispered, "You heard the cries of their parents, did you?" Dead Morose nodded. Roos Kerr, on his left, snorted like a beast of burden. His breath billowed out in great misty clouds. He probably saw his own breath every time. Roos was dark and was darker than the others of his kind. Almost dark enough to be mistaken for a dark elf until you actually encountered one. Excuse me just a second. Elzarel was as gray as the name of his kind. Age had much to do with it, but Dead Morose suspected that panned shade of his eyes, skin, and hair had always been there, giving him a ghostly countenance. Elzarel whispered Roos. Roos did not, however, back down. The humans must fight for themselves. The way we allowed Dead Morose to fight for us all these years, you mean? We fought too, Roos said, and they cry for him to fight with them as well. Roos exhaled a slow cloud of air this time. Then he said, "They beg for a hero to swoop in for them. There are no human armies coming from their villages to save their children. They want a god or a genie to grant them wishes. After they have any survivors back, they'll forget the gift and start asking for more favors, more toys from their benefactor. We've never asked anything of Dead Morose we were not willing to fight for ourselves." Dead continued to stare out as if they weren't talking about him, over him. Let's say about him and over him. It's technically correct the other way too, but I think it reads better, simpler that way. Elzarel said, "Just as he was free to fight for us or leave us to our own wars, he has his own choice of where to turn his powers, who to help, and under what conditions." "I would never suggest otherwise," Roos said, "but I would point out that the peace we have long maintained is a delicate one, and his long stay with us means his actions will reflect on us with any of the old enemies he antagonizes. His choices can no longer be played out in isolation." "Your point is made and understood," Elzarel said. "I'd feel better if I heard it from him." Dead Moreau sighed, but his breath remained invisible. He had been standing here a long time. He finally turned his head to Elzarel and shook it. Ruskur cursed under his breath in a way most unworthy of their high kind. Elzarel nodded back and said, "Your animals and sleigh are harnessed, your weapons ready. We will protect our own borders while you are gone, and we will welcome you back if you choose to return." Dead Moreaus left the elder gray elves and to argue among themselves. That was nothing new, even though the threat might change. Even though the threat, let's say the nature of the threat might have changed. There we go. All right. He mounted his sleigh, strapping one whip to his side and using another to drive the reindeer forward. The ground scraped and scarred under the blades of his sleigh. Their hooves pounded on the hard ice and then picked up speed as the weight moved to the frozen ground. He guided them southward. From the land of the gray elves, everything was south. He centered them on the largest mountain. In time, they would veer toward the darkest canyon between, and finally the most deadly valley beyond. He took a moment to gather his other weapons, daggers, an axe, slings, and more. His gloved hand, sorry, I lost the ability to read. His gloved hand opened and closed over the whip. The distance made the mountains seem to never grow, running forever and getting nowhere, doomed to fail. They were doomed to be too late. Yet the sleigh drew into the canyon, and there was no denying the wild howls. There was no distinguishing the numbers he would face. No one guarded the entrance to that valley. They had harvested a great number of victims, and now they were whipping themselves into a frenzy in their feeding field. Dead Moreaus needed the beasts to carry him faster. There was a good chance the animals might not survive and might be food for the monsters as well. No need to save their energy under those conditions. However, Dead Moreaus did not want to crack a whip and announce his presence before he had to. He either would be in time or would not. Either way, war was upon him. Death was coming for someone. Blood had been spilled or would be shortly. The reindeer burst from the narrow walls and dropped down the steep slope into a place where shadows always ruled. Dead Moreaus lifted his fist and allowed the leather braid with sharp chunks of bone and rock to unfurl behind his back. He was surprised to see fear in their glowing red eyes as they turned their dark faces to him, rushing at them alone. Their curled horns caught what little light filtered in from above. They rose to their full heights and curled their claws. Now he saw the anger and rage he expected from these old enemies. Excuse me. First one growled and turned its face to the sky to howl. Dozens of others joined, then hundreds. The hard walls of the Crampi Valley echoed with terrible sound. At that moment, his sleigh angled. Let's say angled. Yeah, because we're sticking past tense here. At that moment, his sleigh angled enough to see the human children gathered in the center of the pack of Crampi. They huddled together. Many weren't dressed well for this cold. Others appeared to be wearing the ragged remains of bedclothes. They had been snatched in their sleep, it appeared. Many of these children were screaming in terror, but none could be heard over the dying howls of their captors. Dead Moreaus made a decision in that moment. He decided he was willing to die here. He would take as many of them as he could before his end. If it was all of them, he would see these children home. If not, he'd hurt the surviving monsters until they could no longer enjoy their meals. This same paragraph. Cowards stole children in the night, and cowards did not deserve to celebrate victories. All right. he stepped off the moving sleigh in the snow. The unattended reindeer veered away from the threat before they ran headlong into the claws and teeth of the enemy. If he survived this, he'd need the sleigh to travel further south. They started to move at him in a wave, but he brought his terrible whip around, and the vanguard of Crampi suffered for their boldness. It turned out they bled red too, and from their slashes they spilled Christmas bright into the deep snow. Dead felt a wave of unholy joy as he heard them yip like little dogs. He brought the whip around again, but they had retreated a few steps. He tore at the faces of 3 more unlucky monsters. As he swung the whip around a third time, a few brave creatures reached out to catch it. Others bowed their heads and offered their horns to tie up the studded leather. Dead pulled his arm up short and swung his axe from behind his back with the other hand. A couple creatures lost hands at the wrists. Let's say paws. Lost paws at the wrists and stumbled over the other lines to escape. The blade rang off the horn of one of the ducked creatures, and it threw sparks. They snapped at him with their sharp teeth and powerful jaws, but not close enough to get him. It was an act of anger and frustration. They hopped about out of range, but he caught them circling around his flanks. He wasn't sure if this was instinct or strategy, but he couldn't allow it. Dead Moreau's whipped the flanking forces on one side and took the head off of Krampus on the other. Let's say with his axe. With his axe. All right. One creature lunged in low and tore the skin on Dead's shin before it ducked back out of range, licking the blood from its lips. Another picked up the severed head and threw it at him. Dead had to duck. Another came for his calf, but Dead split the back of its skull with a quick move of his axe. In that moment, another was able to cut his bicep through his sleeve with the point of one horn. Dead let out a dog-like yelp of his own. The Crampi hooted and growled in response. They started to move on him en masse, but he whipped away their enthusiasm. They did not, however, back off very far. As he tried to circle away for some better range, they stuck with him, pressing their advance. He needed to get his back to a wall, so he forced his attack to the right and started moving up that rocky slope as they pursued. His partial retreat encouraged them, and he had to fight and dodge all the more. They seemed to handle the hill better going forward than he did shuffling up and backward. Each time his heel caught an unseen rock in the snow, they dove forward at him. He had to keep his feet and drive them back at the same time. They never backed off as far as he'd liked. Though they suffered for their efforts, he wasn't wounding them or killing them deep enough, nor at a rate he would have liked. As he gained elevation and... let me cut a typo there. And the pack followed him up that treacherous hill, he saw the children gathered together and ignored by the angry monsters who brought them here in the night. They could almost stroll out of the valley on their own. We had a missing word. The sleigh and the deer stood waiting near the mouth of the canyon. The beasts would obey let's not say the beasts, because I'm calling the monsters the beasts too. Let's say the reindeer. All right. The reindeer would obey human children's hands upon their reins. Every direction was south from here. They just had to go. But they huddled in fear and would not move. He could yell at them to go, but the Crampi would know then, and he doubted they would even... And he doubted the children, say the frightened children, would even move then. Dead started to think Roos Kerr had a point. They dove in to take another bite of his flesh. He gave them another lash, but this time they wrapped up the braid and pulled the whip and pulled the whip out taut. Their paws sliced and bled, but they wouldn't release it. The others tried to attack as he stood leashed. Dead surrendered the whip to them and fought two-handed with the axe. He hurt and killed a number of them, but they got pieces of him too, and they greatly outnumbered his foolish army of one. His axe buried deep in the skull of one Krampus that tried to ram him in the chest. He could not pull the weapon free, so he had to let that go too. They were too close. Small typo there. They were too close on him for... They were too close in on him for the slings, so he pulled a dagger in each hand. Their hoots and howls started to sound like laughter. It angered him as it filled him with dark fear. Arrows peppered the backs and skulls of the Crampi nearest him. As they fell, he shielded his face, thinking the attack was meant for him. The gray elven army poured into the dark valley of the Crampi. Another volley of arrows dropped more of the monsters before they scattered down the slope. Dead realized they were charging for the children. They were either going to try to eat what they could or kill them for this offense. The gray elves surrounded the human children and fought against the headlong assault of the surviving Crampi. Among them, Dead Moreau spotted Ruskur pulling his sword bloody from a fallen monster. He realized he was more hurt. I need to put his name. Dead realized he was more hurt than he thought as he limped down the slope. Elzarel came to his side and took Dead's arm over his shoulder to help. Dead tilted his head at the elder elf. Elzarel smiled back and said, "We could let you fight alone. We could... I need to fix this. We couldn't let you fight alone after all the times the elf lifted into the air on the horns of a Krampus. His face contorted in pain, and he stabbed at the monster's head with his short sword, but there was no power behind the blows. The beast shook the elf above his head, spilling blood like hot rain that melted into the snow as it fell. Dead took the beast... what am I saying here? Dead attacked... That's better. Dead attacked the beast with his daggers, but it wasn't enough to bring it down. Arrows filled its back like quills as more elven warriors ran to help. Ruskur reached the scene as Elzarel fell to the bloody snow, pale and staring blank into the patch of sky over the deep valley. He cut the offending Krampus, let's say Rus, because we're using a lot of names here. Rus cut the offending Krampus into pieces. The Crampi fled through another pass, with their numbers greatly diminished. The valley grew quiet, leaving only Ruskur. Okay, it's not a dash, it's an apostrophe. Alright. Leaving Ruskur weeping over the body of the greatest of the gray elves. Joining him, the human children shivered and cried as well on the valley floor. After a great deal of time, Ruskur rose and charged Dead Morose with his bloody sword. Dead did not lift his arms. It wasn't clear if he did so by choice or because he wasn't able. A dozen elves stepped in to stop Rus in his tracks. They stripped him. Lots of missing words right now. They stripped him of his weapons and held his arms and body away from Dead. Rus finally cried out, "Take your human pets and be gone. Bring them back to the families who will never be able to keep them safe. We must return to our borders because after all these centuries, we are at war with the Crampi again. Because of you, there will be more death and suffering for everyone. Go and serve your humans. Grant their wishes. Be their toy. You are not among us any longer." Alright, I put the apostrophe in the wrong place in this spelling. Alright. Ruskur pulled away from those who held him. He snatched his sword back and stalked down the hill. The others watched dead Morose a moment. Some of these fighters had known him most of their lives. More than a few had been there in the days when he rescued them from the brink. With the fall of El-Zarel, Roskur was now their leader, and things had changed in an instant. They carried El-Zarel out of that valley. Dead Morose limped to the children and guided them to the sleigh. He covered them in fur blankets, but knew it would not be enough to get them all back alive. Even as he mounted the sleigh, the howls of the surviving Crampi drew closer. He used the smaller whip to drive the reindeer out of the valley. They were eager to go. Dead had no desire to be caught alone again with the vengeful remnant of the hungry Crampi. All right. Out of the canyon and beyond the mountain, he turned the team southward to take the children home. He did not know the exact way from the top of the world, but from the top of the world every direction was south, so there was only one way to go for now. All right, let me add one more thing up here. I was going to do it below, but I think I'm going to add it up here. As the shadows fell away, he turned his wrinkled, say deeply, his deeply wrinkled face up into the cold sun, the cold sunlight. He did not know the exact way, but from the top of the world, every direction was south, so there was only one way to go for now.